Hello and welcome to another edition of This Week in Mishnah Yomi. Today's focus will be inspired by the last two Mishnayos in Mishnah's Peah. I know we're well into TWIMY, but today's learning will be focused on the last Mishnayos in Peah, 8th chapter, 8th and 9th Mishnah. If you recall, it talks about what are the criteria for receiving, being the beneficiary of leket shichan peah, misheyesh lo masayim zuz or yifa leket shichan peah, Sarani, right? That 200 zuz was the metric, was the cutoff of eligibility when it came to leket shichan peah, according to the Mishnah. And if you have more than that, but some of that money is tied up, is bound to a ksuba or other type of mashkon, then you might be able to take, even if you have an estate, your net value is greater than 200 zuz, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to look a little bit closer on this halacha l'maisa and beyond the Mishnah, as far as who is considered poor and ani for eligibility for receiving tzedaka. For instance, the Aruch HaShulchan tells us in Yerodei Simin Reish Nun Aleph Sif Zion that he mentions there the criteria of who is not chayav to give tzedakah. He says that anyone that has more than a little bit of bread and water is already chayav, is already required to give charity. Even poor people have to give charity. But if you're so poor, says the Aruch HaShulchan, that you don't have even a little bit more than bread and water, then you're exempt from giving tzedakah. Is that how poor you have to be in order to receive tzedakah? You have to be so poor that all you have to your name is bread and water? Or is there a different threshold? Obviously, 200 zuz is not that. 200 zuz is understood to be an amount that is enough to buy food and clothing for an entire year. So it would seem implausible that the criteria for receiving tzedakah is so low that anyone that has more than bread and water is ineligible for tzedakah. No, if you're obligated in tzedakah, even if you have a little bit more, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not allowed to accept tzedakah at that level. So perhaps, and this is relevant coming up to Purim, when it comes to Matanos Levionim, Rav Elyashiv is one of those who suggests that the criteria for accepting tzedakah is learned from or is understood through the prism of the criteria for who is eligible to receive Matanos Levionim. Rav Elyashiv writes that, or is quoted as saying that a person that has food and clothing, enough food and clothing and the means to buy food and clothing when necessary, but is unable to meet periodic expenses, even if that's monthly utilities, monthly rent is a struggle, scraped together. Certainly an unexpected medical bill is something that's outside the person's ability to pay for. Such a person would be eligible for Matanos Levionim. So perhaps that's the criteria. Even if a person has much more than just enough bread and water for a day, has enough food, enough resources to support themselves with food and clothing for a year, but it does not have access to emergency funds or even to be able to pay for periodic expenses as simple as consistent as utilities and rent, they would be eligible to receive tzedakah. But someone who can afford a year's expenses, like the Mishnah said, back in the days of the Mishnah, it was 200 zuz. That was a year's expenses. Person who can afford a year's expenses, whatever that means in today's money in the location where you are at, shouldn't take tzedakah on account of, well, I'm okay now, but maybe I'll need for next year. Allow me to take charity now and put it away for savings, lest I not be in the same financial situation. No, and this is going to be an undercurrent that we're going to have to balance, right, between financial planning and bitachon in your current state. And if God has given you what you need for now, then that suffices. And to plan ahead, although it may be a good idea, financial planning with your own resources, it seems to be inappropriate with charity funds to plan ahead, to receive charity funds in order to plan ahead so that you are in a good financial, or at least a a subsistent financial state for the year, for the forthcoming year or years. What about someone with a steady income but has no savings whatsoever? So Rav Wosner, in his Chuvas of Shevet Levi, Chelek Beis Simin Kufchaf, says that a person with a steady source of income but lives subsistently, hand to mouth, and no savings at the end of the month, no savings at the end of the year, such a person should not take tzedakah. They're able to survive. It's a very precarious situation to be in. After all, they have no emergency funds in case anything happens that they need additional resources. But nonetheless, until something comes up that requires them to have money that they don't have now, they should not take tzedakah. The Shulchan Aruch in Yordei Simin Reish Nun Gimel says that obviously a person who's unemployed would be considered poor and worthy of tzedakah funds. There's some discussion about what if a person is unemployed but could get a job, but chooses not to get a job. So on the one hand, obviously everyone has to do their hishtadlus. They have to do what they can in order to be able to survive and to pay their bills and to support themselves and their family if applicable. So on the one hand, one would say someone who refuses to work, who is not working but could work, is not a worthy recipient of tzedakah. However, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky in a tshuva in Amos Yaakov says that, it's hard to be sure and absolutely definite that the person seeking charity could work and chooses not to, right? And therefore, it may not be up to us or within our purview to make that decision to say, oh, you could have a job, you should have a job, you don't, then you're not a worthy recipient. So the Amos Yaakov says, again, there certainly is the ability to choose how you allocate your funds, but to say that because you're not working and I think you should and you could have a job, therefore you're not worthy of any tzedakah allocation, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky says we should be a little bit wary of going down that road. But if someone who's unemployed, we generally will consider them poor and worthy of some tzedakah allocation. What if he has savings? He doesn't have an income currently, but he has savings. So if he can live off the returns on that savings without depleting the principal, or let's say depleting the principal that much. Oftentimes there's a little bit of a depletion of principal, but it won't be depleted anytime soon, then that person's not considered poor. However, if they have savings, but if they were to use their savings, then soon, and it could be a matter of years, but maybe only a matter of months, then they will end up poor if they can't get back on track and find a job, etc., or be able to work a job. So at this point, without a steady income coming in, even though they have access to savings, it may be permissible for them to receive charity funds, and it would be acceptable for them to be a beneficiary of tzedakah. Rav Wosner, of course, points out that the 200 zuz criteria that we mentioned in the Mishnayos at the end of Peah, as I mentioned already, was in that a certain based on a context, that location, that time period, when people had access to Meiser Ani, to Leket, Shikha, and Peah. In other words, there were a number of basic safety net items, specifically produce in the fields of a Jew in Eretz Yisrael, that the poor had access to. And therefore, 200 zuz was the criteria, in addition to the safety net of Leket, Shikha, Peah, Meiser Ani, that they would be able to get Peret, Olos, etc., that we learned about in the Mishnayos previously. However, today, the numbers change because there is no access. Aniyim, by and large, do not have access to Leket, Shikha, and Peah. That itself is an interesting question. Why is it that nowadays there is no access to Leket, Shikha, and Peah? Why is that not something that is Nogea L'maisa? So if I may share my screen just for a second, we will notice the Yerushalmi right here. The Yerushalmi writes, Matnos aniyim shebasada, she'in aniyim makpidin aleihen, harein shabal bayis. Let's say you have a field where poor people don't come. This is Yerushalmi Peah. We don't have this. We don't have this in the Bavli Peah, but in the Yerushalmi Peah it says, let's say there's a field, but the poor people aren't coming to that field to collect leket shichron peah. They're not makpid on it. Harein shabal bayis, the bal bayis can use it. Rabbi Bur ben Chia bay v'yesh adam korei shem lepeah la'atzman. Ma'aner Shimon ben Yochai la'ani v'lager tazov osam v'lo lo'ravim v'la'talifim. And Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai brings a support to this from the pasuk la'ani v'lager tazov osam. The purpose of leaving leket shichron peah is to leave it for the poor person, the stranger, the widow, etc., those who are less fortunate. But not to leave it, if no one's going to come get it, it's a waste. To leave it to the crows and the birds and the bats, they're just going to eat it. No, if they're just going to be left there, then the Baal Bayis can get it. The halachic underpinnings is that we assume that the aniyim, since they don't come, they are miyayish, they're mafkir, excuse me. They give up their claims to those items, and therefore the Baal Bayis can keep them. So being that our aniyim today don't have access to leket shichron peah, they need to have access to additional funds in order to make it work. 200 zuz is not the criteria now in the absence of these safety net agricultural gifts. This is something that the Smak, Sefer Mitzvahs Katan, and Mitzvahs Aseh number 248 notes, as well as the Torah and Siman Reish Nun Gimel Sif Beis, that the Torah points out that the 200 zuz was relevant where there was a kupa and a tamchoy, which we've talked about in the past. Kupa being the daily food bank, and tamchoy being like a Tomchei Shabbos once a week for the weekly needs of people who lived in the community. But if that doesn't exist in a formal way, then we have to allow the demographic of those who are eligible to receive charity is, of course, expanded. There's more need because these other formal avenues of support, like leket shichron peah, kupa and tamchoy, no longer exist to the extent that they might have. The Mishnah in Peah said that at the end of Mishnah, Parakhas Mishnah Ches, says, if a person has a domicile, a person owns a house, they have no income, a person owns some fancy items, right? Some utensils, whatever, artwork, does he have to sell that before he takes advantage of benefits from tzedaka? So the Mishnah Peah says no. The Gemara in Ksuvos, Daf Samach Ches Amud Aleph 68a, notes a contradiction in a brisa. And the way that this contradiction is resolved is quoted in the Rambam as follows. Let me just read it to you. The Rambam in Matnos Aniyim, chapter 9, halacha 14 says, I'll read it in the English, if a poor person is in need who owns a yard and household utensils, even if they are made of silver or gold, they may not require him to sell his home or his utensils. But rather, he is permitted to take tzedakah, and it's a mitzvah to give him. In other words, he is eligible and a worthy recipient of tzedakah, even if he has a net worth based on some of these other assets. But where does this apply, says the Rambam? To utensils for eating, drinking, doing laundry, bedding, similar such activities of daily living. But if the utensils of silver and gold are things such that as a trowel or pestle or something similar, if they're not for activities of daily living, if they're ornamental, right, he must sell them and he gets utensils of lesser value, right? So it's not across the board. Just because you if you don't have any income coming in, that doesn't mean you can keep all of your fancy stuff and still be a worthy recipient of charity. No, it depends. Those items that you're going to use for eating, drinking, sleeping, laundry, etc., wearing clothing, you don't have to sell that. But other items would be appropriate to sell before beginning to accept tzedakah. Rabbeinu Tam in the Tosfos and Ksuvos Daf Samach Ches points out that if he received these, that we are more lenient if he already owned them in the absence of an income. But if he began accepting tzedakah and then came into possession of fancy items, at that point we would say we're less tolerant, and we would say that person should dispose of, sell, some way take advantage of his asset before continuing to receive tzedakah. An interesting corollary to this, and with this we'll end, the Chelkas Yaakov in Yordea, Simin Kuf, Lamed Zayin 137, was asked about a person who is worthy based on the criteria, again, the subjective criteria of worthiness of receiving charity funds. This person is worthy of receiving charity funds. However, they have a bank account. That bank account was designated for expenses associated with this person's children's weddings. So does that count? Do they have to deplete the funds for the children's weddings who have not yet been scheduled? And then when it's time to marry off their children, they'll have to beg, borrow, hopefully not steal, but hope to, through the process of hachnasas kala, try to raise that money? Or is it fair to say that this person has saved money to be used at some later point when he'll need it for hachnasas kala, and now at this point he's considered to be worthy of receiving charity funds? The Chelkas Yaakov says that something as fundamental as necessary as marrying off children, which comes with an expense, different communities have different expenses, but there is an expense there. It's appropriate and halachically recognized to have an account that is untouched for any other purpose. And if, putting aside that savings account, this individual does not have the funds to make it work on a monthly basis, then he indeed would be a worthy recipient of charity funds. That's what the Chelkas Yaakov says. And just fast forwarding, in contemporary poskim, Rav Scheinberg and Rav Chaim Kanievsky agreed to this, whereas Rav Elyashiv was somewhat reluctant to accept this logic, and thought that the funds should be depleted from the savings account that was designated for weddings before the person would take tzedaka. What I think emerges from all of this conversation is that there's this balance. There's this balance from the perspective of the person who is less fortunate. That on the one hand, there is meant to be support for the person. On the other hand, a person is supposed to do whatever he or she is able to in order to support themselves. And from our perspective, from the perspective of the people giving, obviously there is some tovas hana, we might say. The exact allocation of the resources of the funds that we have available, we are blessed with to give tzedakah, is up to us to decide to a great extent who receives those funds. But if a person comes to us, we are confronted with a person who is in need. So these laws should guide us in terms of who are worthy beneficiaries should receive something. The person who is considered to be a worthy beneficiary of tzedakah, as described in our learning today, should always get something. Again, depending on what your resources are and how you want to allocate it, it may be smaller or bigger, but something should be given to those who are worthy of receiving tzedakah. And Hashem should help us all that we are always blessed to be in the position to help others, to be in a position to give generously, and in so doing, Hashem should continue to bless us generously and kind. Tune in next week for another edition of This Week in Mishnah Yomi.